Ladies and gentlemen, dear audience from Amsterdam, Frankfurt, London, Paris, what a privilege to address all of you with these modern technology. Really thank you, all of you, for speaking places, to invite me to address this very small topic, how to combine EU subsidiarity principle with the need for strengthened European political integration. I noticed that you didn't suggest that I should discuss economic or financial integration. Let me first recall how much the subsidiarity principle was introduced in a political and institutional dialogue on the future of the European Community in the late 80s by Jacques Delors with one concern, which was to move forward a more federalist Europe. It was meant to ensure in the end the respect of sovereignty entrenched in the EU law with the Maastricht Treaty, but to allow a move forward. And to start, maybe I would like just to tell you a little anecdote. Once Klaus Hensch, as president of the European Parliament, was visiting Paris at a time where Philippe Séguin was chairing the National Assembly. For those who don't remember, he was a strong opponent to the Maastricht Treaty because it was going to be a much too strong political integration biased. And both of them had a very, very exciting discussion about subsidiarity. And the conclusion that Klaus Hensch made was for me a real driver that I always recall, that subsidiarity can only exist if you're ready to allow the top level to get some power in a shared manner. And so you can always look at subsidiarity from both sides, coming from the top to the down or from the bottom to the top. But the only question in the end, the arbitrage should be, where is it going to be the most efficient dealt with? Of course, we have definition about what should be exclusive competence, and somehow for the item that we are concerned about, there's one very strong exclusive competence, which is about monetary policy. So you could imagine with this driver, you could live with a reasonable concept of subsidiarity and efficiency. Of course, as you know, it was in the end, this concept was introduced in the treaty, but I'm not so sure everybody remember that when the protocol on subsidiarity was introduced in the treaty, it was introduced with another word that is now very much in fashion, which is proportionality. So the protocol is about subsidiarity and proportionality. And because of this, national parliaments can oppose an initiative by the Commission. This is the famous yellow card, where you have 8 weeks, where a third of a national parliament can oppose a proposal, and then the Commission has to modify or review its proposal. Interestingly enough, this proposal was never used because of proportionality, and I don't want to give any idea to anybody, of course, to use it. It was only launched 3 times, in 2012 about collective action, 2013 about European prosecutor, and 2016 about posting workers directive. So you can see it was never addressed because of financial markets. So maybe that's a good news. So that it means you have a good ground to imagine that subsidiarity is not the best driver when it comes to financial markets. Nevertheless, this principle of subsidiarity should also be combined with the one that is in the heart of the mandate by the Commission, which is about the general European interests. And this is where sometimes you have some strong discussion in the Council, where obviously the driving line is not so easy to define. What I understand is that when we are here confronted with a political problem, where, to my understanding, we should definitely move from more subsidiarity to more integration, just for 2 reasons. Because non-cooperative policy making this means the statu quo, has resulted worse than the alternative. And second, agreement to cooperate without centralization are not credible. There are many credible examples for this. The first one, of course, is about taxation, where you can see that unanimity in the Council, and unanimity is the best tools against a stronger integration, of course. You can see that it has been an obstacle to address tax evasion, tax avoidance, and sometimes agreement with multinational to lower tax in exchange of implementation, diminishing revenue of member state. But of course, I would like to take 1 minute or two about the topic we are now discussing, which is about financial market and integration of financial market. As you know, my last report in the European Parliament after 25 years in a very exciting and incredible mandate that unfortunately not enough citizens do understand what it is about, because it's about changing their life and making it easier. I go back to my subject. So this last report was about the review of the European Supervision Authority, the famous ESAs. And I've been confronted with such a contradiction that I need to disclose it. The mere reason for this proposal for a reform by the Commission was a pure logic understanding of what is a CMU. If you want to have a capital market union, you need to have an integrated supervision. That's crystal clear. Any academics will tell you this. Any normal observer of the market would tell this. And on top of this, we had the experience that with the banking union, when we did the Lamfalussy strategy without doing the supervision strategy in the same place, we had a problem in the end. So let's not repeat this default. And I have to admit, those of you who know me, I've been fighting quite a lot to make sure to achieve as much as I could. But in the end, I was blocked by member states telling me that their hand on the heart, they wanted deeply to increase the capacity of the capital market union. They really wanted a truly fledged, integrated, cross-border capital market union, but that the ESA needed to remain member state-driven institution. And we've seen the result of this. It has a name. It's called Danske Bank. Danske Bank was decided by EBA, by the Board of Supervisors of EBA, 2 days after the conclusion of the negotiation on the review of the ESAs. They had a clear opportunity to demonstrate that they had been right to incentivize their member state not to give an inch on their power. And they went against all the expertise and the demonstration they had received in a report. I thought that following the rapport de force, it would be very difficult in the next Commission to reopen the governance of the ESA. But now, after what has happened in the Board of Supervisors of EBA, where I understand only one member state thought it should be a sanction, the gameplay among member states is going on, and it goes against the interest of the European citizen, because the interest of the citizen is, in the end, to have a capital market union that does work, and that is not only for the bankers that we do need this capital market union. It's also to make sure that we have a better financing of the union. In the end, if we don't do it, we go too late, too little, and we give ground and food for those who oppose the European project, because we are not able to realize the target we have defined for our people. So please stand strong and move from a fully fledged understood subsidiarity to well-applied integration. I wish you a good debate.
J'ai demandé à Robert Ophel, Stéphane Giordano. Alors, je n'ai pas vu si Nicolas Calcone, oui, Nicolas Calcone était là, de me rejoindre. Alors merci Pervenche parce que c'est une formidable introduction à nos deux débats suivants en vérité. Le premier qui va être encore dans un terrain assez connu et assez familier de nous autres. Le second, le débat européen qui est un peu plus improbable, vous verrez, parce que nous avons des invités de nos autres places financières qui sont sur des sujets qui sont un peu plus borderline pour nous. On a donc beaucoup parlé supervision. On a beaucoup parlé CMU ce matin. On a beaucoup parlé supervision aussi. On est dans des systèmes où on a effectivement une supervision qui est encore un petit peu éclatée et entre zone euro, zone non euro, banque et non banque. Et donc on voulait démarrer ce panel avec Robert Ophel probablement pour nous dire un petit peu. Pervenche, je viens de parler de la question de la réforme des ESA. Effectivement, on était sur un projet ambitieux. On était sur un projet sur lequel d'ailleurs l'AMF avait été très vocale. Et on a abouti finalement à pas grand-chose. Et donc on voudrait avoir votre analyse sur cela. Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? Qu'est-ce qui a bugué au passage? Voilà, votre vision de cette discussion politique sur les ESA.
Je dirais que pour faire une union, il faut que les gens soient d'accord pour abandonner une partie de leur souveraineté. C'est comme ça. Et là, on a vu que on n'était pas d'accord. Il y a une large majorité des pays qui n'étaient pas d'accord pour abandonner une partie de leur souveraineté, alors même que s'il y a des domaines dans lesquels une approche convergente, unifiée de la réglementation, de la supervision a un sens, c'est bien les services financiers, puisque les services financiers, ils ont vocation à être proposés dans l'ensemble de l'Union, où que l'on soit localisé et où on a un certain nombre d'institutions financières qui ont une portée à l'évidence systémique pour l'ensemble de l'Union. On n'a pas voulu le faire. Qu'est-ce qu'on aurait pu faire pour accroître la convergence et avoir une approche unifiée du domaine? On aurait pu faire trois choses. On aurait pu renforcer les pouvoirs de supervision directe de l'ESMA, en l'occurrence. On aurait pu renforcer les outils de convergence entre les autorités nationales qui sont à la main de l'ESMA, et on aurait pu renforcer le caractère européen de la gouvernance de l'ESMA au lieu d'avoir une confrontation, je dirais, d'intérêts nationaux comme on a pu le voir. Sur ces trois domaines-là, des progrès ont été faits, mais ils sont très limités. Très limités. On sait qu'en supervision directe, en gros, pour ce qui se passe à l'intérieur de l'Union, on a rajouté des institutions qui s'occupent des reporting de données, et on a rajouté quelqu'un qui n'existe pas, c'est-à-dire ceux qui peuvent faire des consolidated tape providers, c'est-à-dire des gens qui peuvent faire ça. Il n'y en a pas aujourd'hui, donc on les a rajoutés. C'est bien, c'est quand il n'y en a pas, c'est plus facile de le rajouter, ça met personne donc on a fait très peu de choses en supervision directe. En outils de convergence, on a fait des choses, mais ça va pas très loin. Quand on dit on va faire un document dans lequel toutes les meilleures pratiques de supervision en Europe vont être réunies, c'est utile, mais ça va pas changer la face des choses. Quand on fait quand on garde le concept de la peer review, qui est un concept, la review, c'est revue par les pairs. Donc, on sait ce que c'est les revues. Le président maintenant de la revue par les pairs sera de l'ESMA et ça sera pas une autorité nationale. Donc on a fait un progrès, mais on n'est pas arrivé et on a fait quelque chose qui est intéressant. Il y a beaucoup, vous savez, ces autorités font des Q&A, des questions-réponses. Des questions-réponses, pour être franc, il y en a des milliers. C'est une énorme... Donc là, elles ont été reconnues, mais on a dit officiellement, vous savez, toutes les Q&A, leur respect est facultatif. Leur respect est facultatif, et d'ailleurs, on ne sait pas qui les respecte et qui les respecte pas. Donc c'est un outil de convergence qui est quand même assez faible. Et quant à la gouvernance qui est clé, qui est de dire est-ce qu'il y a une gouvernance européenne ou est-ce que c'est une collection de superviseurs nationaux qui sont là, ben, on est resté en gros à l'état actuel. Je dirais même qu'on a complexifié le système parce que quand on le combine avec la réforme d'Emir sur les chambres de compensation, on aura au niveau de l'ESMA une architecture de gouvernance très compliquée avec un conseil de supervision de chambres de compensation à l'intérieur de l'ESMA avec donc tout ça est là. Je veux dire, moi j'ai le sentiment que quand un match a été joué, et il a été joué vraiment avec force par tous les participants, je suis pas sûr qu'il faille le rejouer le lendemain. On verra s'il y a des opportunités, mais voilà, il y a eu un débat très profond, des décisions ont été prises, dont acte. Maintenant, essayons de construire quand même, sans refaire cette discussion trop rapidement. Je ne crois pas qu'il y ait un espace pour le faire, parce que ça a traduit un choix politique très fort, qui est de dire nous ne souhaitons pas transférer à une autorité européenne des pouvoirs significatifs supplémentaires. Alors peut-être parce que, il peut y avoir beaucoup de raisons, hein. Quand on transfère des pouvoirs, il faut avoir confiance dans la manière dont ces pouvoirs vont être exercés, et il faut que les gens à qui on transfère ce pouvoir aient le devoir de pouvoir en rendre compte à l'ensemble des mandants. Cela étant, c'était, dans mon esprit, c'était une condition nécessaire à la construction d'une union des marchés de capitaux effective, mais ce n'était pas une condition suffisante. On a vu que dans l'union bancaire, on a un superviseur unique, et pourtant on n'a pas d'union bancaire achevée. Donc c'est une condition nécessaire, mais pas suffisante.
Et comment dans ce contexte-là, on relance la CMU, comme Pervenche le signalait, c'est quand même un peu intrinsèquement...
Non, mais il y a plein de choses à faire. Il y a plein de choses à faire, et il y a des dossiers qui s'ouvrent, et dans mon esprit, il y a un certain nombre de dossiers prioritaires sur lesquels on peut trouver des accords et construire quelque chose ensemble. On a le dossier de la digitalisation de la finance. C'est un dossier qui est devant nous. On sait que dans la digitalisation de la finance, il y a des domaines qui ne sont pas réglementés, ou c'est ce que l'on vient d'essayer de faire en France avec tout ce qui est ICO et prestataires de services de numériques. Et il y a des dossiers qui sont réglementés, mais qui ne sont pas adaptés à la finance digitale. La sécurisation, la digitalisation des titres financiers traditionnels et des opérations financières traditionnelles, les réglementations actuelles ne sont pas adaptées à ce développement-là. Il faut donc qu'on les reprenne pour pouvoir collectivement, en Europe, avoir c'est la même chose pour la finance durable. La finance durable, c'est quelque chose qui peut se construire au niveau européen et qui est en cours de construction. Et donc là, ce sont des dossiers sur lesquels il faut qu'on avance. On peut aussi, il y a des revues qui sont prévues. Des revues, moi j'attache beaucoup d'importance à tout ce qui va tourner autour de la gestion d'actifs, parce que la gestion d'actifs, c'est un monde un peu particulier. On voit bien que la gestion d'actifs, la subsidiarité nationale a ses limites. C'est quoi la gestion d'actifs? Vous êtes une société de gestion dans un pays, vous immatriculez vos fonds dans un autre pays, vous déléguez la gestion d'une partie dans un troisième pays et vous les commercialisez ailleurs. Je veux dire, si on n'a pas une approche coordonnée, convergente de ces activités-là qui se développent très rapidement, puisque l'activité bancaire elle-même est un peu contrainte, donc par construction qui se développe, si on n'a pas une approche coordonnée en Europe, on a un problème. Et donc, il y a des revues. Est-ce que c'est normal qu'à l'actif d'un OPCVM, on ne mette pas la même chose dans un pays et dans un autre, alors qu'on peut le vendre dans l'ensemble de la... Donc, il y a des revues d'AIFM, il y a des revues du site, il faut qu'on puisse les mettre à profit pour faire des progrès dans ces dimensions-là. Et on peut le faire indépendamment de la réforme des ESA, je crois.
Nicolas, alors d'abord, merci d'avoir pris au débeauté ce panel. C'était Yves Perrier qui devait participer à ce panel. Nicolas est donc le responsable de la finance, des affaires publiques et de la stratégie d'Amundi. On parlait donc des acteurs de gestion d'actifs qui, par nature, évidemment, sont très pan-européens. Vous êtes un des acteurs, un des quelques acteurs pan-européens dans le domaine. Est-ce que la réglementation, d'une façon ou d'une autre, vous gêne dans votre concurrence avec notamment les anglo-saxons? Est-ce qu'il y a des choses qui vous inquiètent dans l'évolution de la réglementation post-discussion des ESA, post-CMU aussi?
Alors, ce qui peut nous inquiéter, c'est, de manière générale, pas tant les évolutions, en tant que telles, les évolutions réglementaires qu'on voit au sein de l'Europe, que l'articulation entre ce qui peut être fait au niveau européen et dans d'autres zones du monde, en particulier les États-Unis, et potentiellement demain le Royaume-Uni si le Brexit se confirme. Juste peut-être pour revenir sur le point des ESA, je pense que pour un acteur effectivement pan-européen comme nous, il est important d'avoir un corpus défini au niveau européen qui soit cohérent et appliqué de façon consistante. Donc ça ne veut pas forcément dire, en tout cas dans le domaine de la gestion d'actifs, des pouvoirs de supervision directs importants pour une autorité européenne, parce que dans la gestion d'actifs, il y a le nombre de décisions individuelles d'autorisation est tellement important qu'on risque d'engorger un niveau européen, et là pour le coup la subsidiarité doit jouer, mais en revanche avoir des outils de convergence importants et une gouvernance plus forte en l'occurrence par exemple de l'ESMA aurait été bienvenue. Peut-être juste un point aussi sur cette réforme des ESA ou un peu plus large. Il y a une institution qu'on oublie, qui n'est pas au sens strict une ESA, mais qu'on oublie parfois, qui est le SRB, le European Systemic Risk Board, qui est aussi importante et de plus en plus importante, qui traite des sujets légitimes. Et en termes de gouvernance, je pense qu'il est encore un peu déséquilibré au profit principalement de banques centrales. Or, elle aborde de plus en plus et de façon légitime des sujets qui dépassent les sujets strictement bancaires, et une meilleure représentation, par exemple, des autorités de marché qui connaissent ces sujets et ces acteurs aurait été la bienvenue. Sinon, pour revenir à votre question sur les sujets réglementaires, je pense qu'il y a un point qui est peut-être encore insuffisamment pris en compte dans la définition des objectifs, le cadre de la réglementation, de la législation européenne, c'est un objectif de compétitivité. Tout ce qui a été fait depuis des ans, et très légitimement, a été axé sur la protection des investisseurs, d'une part, et la stabilité financière. Et c'est évidemment des objectifs légitimes et qu'il faut poursuivre. Mais je pense que pour être efficace, et aussi pour avoir des acteurs qui fonctionnent bien et qui répondent aux objectifs du type de ceux d'une CMU, il faut aussi avoir un objectif, en tout cas intégrer un troisième pilier, un troisième objectif qui est celui de compétitivité. C'est quelque chose quand on voit, j'étais la semaine dernière à Washington, quand on rencontre des autorités, des régulateurs américains qui semblent clairement pris en compte, et dans leur approche, y compris parfois dans leur volonté d'exporter leur réglementation, l'approche davantage compétitive que ça peut donner à leur industrie est pris en compte. Demain, là aussi, avec le Brexit, quand on voit les propos récents du président de la FCA sur la volonté d'avoir une approche moins rule-based et plus principle-based, comme on dit en anglais, plus pragmatique, évidemment, ils vont vous dire ça n'est pas dans un objectif de moins-disant réglementaire. Je ne pense pas que ce soit le cas, mais en tout cas, ça veut dire que quelque part, ils vont prendre cette dimension. Et je pense que c'est quelque chose qui est encore pas complètement pris en compte dans la définition des réglementations européennes. Et quand on voit l'accumulation et parfois des changements de réglementation qui ont été faits de façon successive, qui sont accumulés alors qu'on n'a pas encore pu voir les impacts réels de réglementations précédentes, quand on voit les sujets par exemple autour de PRIPS, on voit que certains textes n'ont pas forcément été bien préparés. C'est pas bon d'ailleurs pour les objectifs poursuivis en termes d'investissement, de protection de l'investisseur ou de stabilité financière, et parfois ça peut être aussi un inconvénient en termes de compétitivité. Et encore une fois, je pense que ce troisième objectif, qui permet d'avoir des acteurs forts, puissants, qui délivrent ce pourquoi on les attend, c'est-à-dire développer un marché de capitaux efficient, développer les produits d'épargne qui répondent aux besoins de long terme des épargnants et de l'économie, ces objectifs doivent être pris en compte. Peut-être une illustration, et je pense que ça peut être un sujet de CMU, c'est le sujet par exemple de la reconnaissance des groupes. On a effectivement des acteurs qui sont pan-européens, qui interviennent sur un marché pan-européen, mais la reconnaissance du fait que il s'agit en fait de groupes qui vont avoir par exemple des sociétés de gestion dans plusieurs pays est très peu reconnue. Et quand on pense par exemple au sujet de la délégation, je pense qu'on ne peut pas aborder le sujet de la délégation dans l'asset management de la même façon quand on observe une délégation d'une société de gestion européenne vers une autre société de gestion européenne du même groupe, donc qui s'appuie sur les mêmes outils de contrôle des risques, d'encadrement réglementaire. On ne peut pas traiter ça de la même façon qu'une délégation à une société située hors d'Europe et hors d'un groupe européen. Et ça, la réglementation ne le reconnaît pas aujourd'hui.
Vous parlez souvent de concurrence américaine. Le Brexit, ça vous inquiète sur quoi? Enfin, qu'est-ce que ça peut changer dans votre métier?
Dans l'immédiat, je pense que ça n'a pas d'impact immédiat majeur, ne serait-ce que par exemple pour les acteurs qui sont anglo-saxons basés au Royaume-Uni. Le fondement, la base qui leur permet de vendre, de distribuer en Europe, c'est justement la délégation et qu'elle va continuer à perdurer, être possible, avec plus d'attention à ce qui est légitime et plus de coordination, on l'espère, entre les différents régulateurs dans le contrôle qu'ils font sur la délégation. Mais c'est quelque chose qui va rester possible, donc qui ne devrait pas avoir un impact majeur sur le marché, à notre sens, dans l'asset management. À plus long terme, c'est ce que j'indiquais un peu sur la référence que je faisais au propos de la FCA. Voilà, il faudra voir comment évolue l'encadrement, la réglementation, et ce qu'il n'y a pas un risque de divergence. Je pense que au départ, les intentions, en tout cas les propos, sont clairement de ne pas aller dans le sens de divergence, mais je pense que au fil du temps, ça sera un sujet qui devra être suivi, d'où l'importance d'avoir une attention importante au sujet de l'équivalence, de les regarder de façon attentive. C'est des notions qui n'ont pas été conçues au départ avec la possibilité que ça puisse intervenir auprès d'un acteur aussi proche que nous et aussi important. Demain, c'est des sujets qui deviennent plus importants et bon, je sais que les autorités européennes sont attentifs à ce point et souhaitent par exemple s'assurer qu'on regarde ces sujets d'équivalence dans la durée.
Oui, on avait des pays tiers de petite taille proche et on avait des pays tiers de grande taille éloignés. Puis là, on découvre le pays tiers de grande taille proche. Stéphane, président de l'AMAFI, en tant que président de l'AMAFI, pas en tant que Société Générale ici, qu'est-ce que c'est votre analyse sur ces sujets-là de pays tiers de façon générale, d'équivalence de façon générale?
D'abord, il y a une analyse qui doit être faite de ce qui s'est passé en 2011 pendant la crise de liquidité. On a vu les ressources allouées au financement de l'économie européenne par des groupes internationaux être retirées extrêmement rapidement. Et la conclusion, c'est quand même sans doute qu'il est nécessaire de construire une capacité autonome au sein de l'Union européenne de financement de l'économie européenne. Et ça veut dire probablement que ça pose sans doute des questions de fragmentation des marchés financiers, au moins en termes d'accès à la clientèle des marchés, et ça pose la question de quelle intégration on veut pour les marchés de l'Union versus quel traitement on veut pour les pays tiers. En la matière, la question de l'intégration des marchés de l'Union est extrêmement importante parce que post-Brexit, enfin, je fais partie de ceux qui n'ont pas complètement abandonné l'idée que le Brexit va finir par arriver. Post-Brexit, on va se retrouver avec des marchés qui vont avoir la particularité au sein de l'Union d'être naturellement assez fragmentés ou en tout cas multipolaires. Là où précédemment, dans une Union à 28, on avait une place qui était d'une telle taille que la question de la multipolarité ne se posait pas vraiment. Post-Brexit, on a des marchés qui vont être multipolaires et il est d'autant plus important de ce point de vue-là de réussir à les intégrer pour recréer un peu des externalités positives qui existaient à Londres et qui existaient à Londres du fait que tout le monde était à Londres, tout le monde travaillait dans le même droit avec la même langue véhiculaire. Post-Brexit, on va être dans une situation différente et ça renforce l'importance de l'intégration au sein de l'Union et ça renforce évidemment aussi l'importance de comment traite-t-on les pays tiers. Et en la matière, le traitement des pays tiers, c'est aussi un sujet de convergence entre les différents États membres, puisque on a un dispositif en matière de services financiers qui est maintenant bien connu, parce qu'on s'y est tous beaucoup penchés ces derniers temps, qui est le mécanisme de l'équivalence. Ce mécanisme, effectivement, il n'avait pas été pensé pour le cas d'un marché tiers proche et de grande taille. Il a été revu, alors pas nécessairement avec le niveau d'ambition initial, mais il a été revu dans le cadre de la revue du traitement prudentiel des entreprises d'investissement. Reste la question du traitement par chaque État membre et les décisions nationales qui peuvent être prises pour l'accès des acteurs de pays tiers. Là-dessus, c'est clairement un sujet qui peut un peu inquiéter si on considère les décisions qui ont pu être prises par certains États membres qui paraissent assez permissives quant à l'accès par les entités de pays tiers aux marchés nationaux. Encore une fois, ça peut être un vrai frein, ça, pour le coup, si ça s'inscrit dans la durée, ça peut être un vrai frein à l'intégration et au renforcement des marchés financiers intra-européens.
C'est un sujet vraiment fondamental où il y a deux aspects différents. Donc, en l'absence d'équivalence sous MIFIR, c'est les régimes nationaux qui s'appliquent. Et les régimes nationaux, ils sont très différents d'un pays à l'autre. Par exemple, il y a des pays qui disent « Vous pouvez intervenir chez moi sans être présent physiquement chez moi ». Puis il y en a d'autres qui disent « Bah si, il faut être présent ». Donc déjà, ça crée une distinction très forte et une compétition à l'intérieur de l'Europe très malsaine. Parce que évidemment, on n'a pas le passeport quand on dans la relation bilatérale avec le dit pays. Mais d'un autre côté, ça peut inciter des entreprises européennes à s'installer dans ce pays et à y localiser leurs activités financières parce que au détriment de l'autre. Et puis, il y a un deuxième aspect qui s'est greffé, qui est des mesures d'urgence pour gérer un Brexit sans accord. Et là, ce sont des mesures en principe temporaires, qui sont entre 1 an et 2 ans après le Brexit, mais qui sont très différentes, là aussi, d'un pays à l'autre. Et là, on voit bien que le principe de subsidiarité dans ces domaines-là n'a pas de sens. Ça se traduit par une fragmentation et par une concurrence malsaine entre les pays. Je veux dire, je suis tout à fait en ligne avec ce qui vient d'être dit.
Il y a un autre domaine où la subsidiarité ne fait pas de sens, c'est dans le. Alors, c'est pas tout à fait votre casquette actuelle, c'est sur l'union bancaire. Vous avez évoqué tout à l'heure le fait qu'on n'avait pas terminé l'union bancaire. Qu'est-ce que c'est votre analyse là-dessus? Qu'est-ce qui manque? Qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire encore? Si je peux vous interroger sur une casquette qui est différente de la vôtre.
Ce qui manque, c'est bien connu. Hein. C'est de dire c'est d'assurer une fluidité des mouvements de la liquidité et des fonds propres à l'intérieur de l'union, de la zone, au moins de la zone euro, et de pouvoir traiter la zone euro comme une zone unique et pas comme une collection de pays. Or, les dispositifs d'assurance de dépôt ou même les dispositifs de résolution avec la localisation du TILAC et autres font que mécaniquement on ne traite pas la zone comme étant une entité géographique unique. Donc on est en train de faire évoluer un certain nombre de choses, en particulier sur le calcul de la systémicité des activités bancaires qui jusqu'à présent étaient augmentées à mesure des relations intra-zone euro entre pays, qui était quand même un paradoxe extraordinaire pour une union bancaire. Bon, mais on n'est encore pas au bout du dispositif.
Et pour refaire le lien entre nos deux sujets, suite à l'affaire Danske Bank, on a vu que la réforme des ESA s'est orientée à un moment donné vers des compétences accrues pour le BA. Là aussi, qu'est-ce que c'est votre analyse?
Le principe de subsidiarité, ça commence par, on commence par faire des directives avec transposition qui sont minimales. Donc ça veut dire ensuite on se rend compte, donc c'est le cas des directives sur le blanchiment. Les directives sur le blanchiment ne sont d'harmonisation minimale. Donc quand vous avez un texte d'harmonisation minimale, c'est extrêmement difficile d'aller donner des pouvoirs de surveillance et à une autorité européenne. Parce que par construction, chaque pays, donc ensuite on fait ça, ensuite on fait on fait des directives à harmonisation maximale, et puis ensuite on fait des règlements d'application directe. Mais comme il y a 28 superviseurs, on se dit, oh là là, je vais mettre un maximum de choses dans mon règlement pour éviter que chacun n'en fasse qu'à sa tête. Donc on a une réglementation de niveau 1 extraordinairement touffue, précise et autres, puis qui en plus résulte de discussions entre les co-législateurs, donc c'est un peu complexe. Et une fois qu'on l'a mis, on se rend compte évidemment qu'on est rentré dans un niveau de précision tel que dans la mise en œuvre, on a des problèmes. Mais là, pour les modifier, ça devient extrêmement difficile. Non, Non, c'est une autre. Après, c'est un problème de gouvernance des autorités. Mais tout ça pour dire que le chemin est long vers une supervision qui soit unifiée d'une manière ou d'une autre. Il y a tout un process qui est complexe. Et on a cité Andrew Bailey, le discours qu'il a fait il y a une dizaine de jours chez Bloomberg, qui est très très illustratif et qui montre que évidemment notre appareil normatif peut être challengé extrêmement fort par un Royaume-Uni qui sera beaucoup plus alerte, agile et dans l'évolution de sa réglementation par rapport à notre architecture à nous, qui est extrêmement complexe et qui est très 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 difficile à faire bouger, même sur des détails parfois.
On a quelques minutes devant nous. Le format local nous le permet, le cas échéant. S'il y a des questions, parce qu'il y a beaucoup de gens très compétents dans la salle sur ces sujets-là, j'en vois plein. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions pour l'un ou l'autre de nos panélistes sur ces sujets-là? Non?
Je veux dire, peut-être, quand on parle de subsidiarité avec mes collègues, il y a souvent une idée qui revient qui consiste à dire il faut appliquer la subsidiarité pour les opérations avec le détail, le retail, et par contre, il faut avoir une approche très centralisée pour les opérations wholesale, de marché, etc. C'est une fausse bonne idée. C'est une fausse bonne idée parce que maintenant, les opérations retail, elles se traitent de manière de plus en plus digitale sur des plateformes de distribution qui sont qui sont globales. Même les fonds, maintenant, de plus en plus, et je crois que de plus en plus, ils seront cotés. Et dès lors qu'on cote le fonds, on voit bien qu'on change de dimension. Et lorsqu'on a mis en œuvre on a mis en œuvre les dispositifs de product intervention, c'est-à-dire ce qui interdit à l'interdiction des options, la vente des options binaires, par exemple, à la clientèle de détail, on voit bien. Alors c'est temporaire, ça a été un peu amélioré par la réforme qui vient d'être faite, mais ça reste temporaire et seules les autorités nationales peuvent le mettre en œuvre sans limite de temps. Donc l'ESMA a pris sa responsabilité, maintenant ça arrive au bout. Ça arrive au bout, ça veut dire qu'on va avoir 28 pays qui vont décliner cette interdiction de vente d'options binaires et de CFD à fort effet de levier, avec une bonne chance, chacun à sa sauce. Vous imaginez ? 28 pays, les options binaires, les options binaires c'est simple encore, mais les CFD, 28 solutions différentes pour des opérations de retail, ça n'a pas de sens pour l'industrie, ça n'a pas de sens non plus pour ceux qui veulent surveiller, et alors même que ces produits se vendent sur des plateformes de distribution générale. Donc je crois que c'est une mauvaise idée, mauvaise approche de dire subsidiarité pour les opérations avec de détail, et par contre centralisation pour les opérations wholesale.
Sur le retail, on doit être honnête, c'est aussi de la défense et un peu un aspect forteresse assiégée qui peut conduire aussi l'industrie à avoir ces discours-là, parce qu'effectivement sur le retail, on a toujours peur des nouveaux entrants de cette nature. Non, alors j'ai pas réussi à avoir du succès avec la tentative de question. Véronique.
C'est le mot titrisation. Et pour nous, c'est un des ponts tout à fait essentiels entre ces deux concepts, puisque l'un des objectifs initiaux de la CMU, c'était de réduire la dépendance considérée comme excessive de l'économie européenne au financement bancaire. Et par ailleurs, la titrisation est évidemment une source d'actifs qui pourrait aussi contribuer au développement de la CMU, peut-être même un safe asset, puisqu'on parle de standard STS titrisation maintenant. Est-ce que ce n'est pas un sujet qui permettrait justement de relancer la CMU dans une approche un petit peu plus pragmatique, puisqu'on voit que malheureusement le projet STS a beaucoup de mal à entrer dans les faits. C'est vrai que c'est un sujet neuf, mais on a créé énormément de complexité autour des critères d'éligibilité, et les règles prudentielles et notamment la notion de transfert de risque est aussi extrêmement compliquée à mettre en œuvre avec la BCE. Donc, est-ce que ça reste une priorité de la CMU? Et si oui, comment est-ce qu'on pourrait avancer?
Je pense que l'ensemble de l'industrie partage ce qui vient d'être dit, c'est-à-dire l'importance de développer la titrisation pour avoir des marchés financiers au sein de l'Union qui soient plus profonds et plus efficaces. Et est également partagé le constat que malheureusement la réglementation qui a été passée n'atteint pas l'objectif de relancer ce marché. Et en réalité, si on doit considérer qu'il y a deux choses qui manquent dans les marchés financiers européens pour atteindre la profondeur nécessaire, il y a d'une part la titrisation et d'autre part les fonds de pension. Donc parlons de la titrisation. Le fait est qu'on n'a pas du tout la même structure que les marchés américains en la matière. On a sans doute des problématiques de droit pour pouvoir avoir des titrisations pan-européennes immédiatement efficaces. Mais on a aussi, c'est vrai, une suspicion qui continue et qui a été sans doute aussi à l'origine du manque d'ambition dans la réforme STS.
On a parlé des acteurs, là ce sont les produits. L'ambition c'est de construire des produits effectivement pan-européens et qui puissent Or, donc STS, je dirais là aussi le match est joué, on a eu une réforme, il ne semble pas qu'elle produise tous les effets attendus. J'attire l'attention sur le fait que les covered bonds viennent de faire l'objet d'un texte européen. Donc, et le covered bonds, il est dans l'ADN européen, c'est vrai. Alors, évidemment, on ne sort pas du bilan les opérations, mais le covered bonds, donc moi, ce que je regrette beaucoup, c'est que le projet de titres adossés à des titres souverains, enfin, soit n'ait pas prospéré. Ce dossier-là n'avance pas, qui aurait pu permettre la création d'un actif, pas sans risque, mais parce que rien n'est sans risque, mais d'un actif à risque bien divisé sur tous les souverains de l'Union et qui serait un déclencheur de l'affaiblissement du lien entre le système bancaire et l'État dans lequel il est installé. Ce projet-là, il est passé au Parlement, mais le Conseil ne prospère pas. Donc je mentionnais celui-là qui est important dans mon esprit.
Il va me rester à remercier nos panélistes. Je pense qu'on arrive à peu près au bout de notre temps. Merci beaucoup encore d'être venu, Nicolas. Merci Robert. Merci Stéphane. Et on va continuer maintenant avec un panel européen.
Und ich habe bereits 2002 dafür ein Modell entwickelt und 2016, sind wir sehr stolz, hat die Europäische Kommission dieses Modell aufgenommen. Das geht im Prinzip so, dass der weltweite Gewinn eines Unternehmens zugrunde gelegt wird und dann nach konkreten, faktischen, realen Faktoren wie Umsatz oder wie Mitarbeiterzahl aufgebrochen wird auf die einzelnen Staaten. Und da kann jeder Staat auf diesen Anteil des Gewinnes seinen Steuersatz erheben. Sehr sinnvoll, allerdings muss man sagen, leider nicht durchsetzbar, weil wir im Bereich der Körperschaftssteuergesetzgebung Einstimmigkeit erfordern. Und all die Staaten, die von den verschiedenen nationalen Steuersystemen profitieren, dagegen sind. Das sind 5, 6, keine Chance, das jemals durchzusetzen.
Dann
nochmal, denn das war als letztes Statement sozusagen zur Arbeitslosenversicherung. Sehr, sehr wichtig und freue mich auch, dass Herr Nasmith unterschrieben hat, dass prinzipiell der Gedanke, dass man eine Absicherung der Bevölkerung braucht, anerkannt wird und dass man nicht denkt, das ist ein Luxus. Zweitens glaube ich, dass alle realistischen Absicherungssysteme, auch andere Sozialversicherungen, davon ausgehen, dass in Bulgarien und in Deutschland nicht dieselbe Arbeitslosenversicherung höhemäßig gezahlt wird, sondern dass es eine Angemessenheit geben muss zum Bruttosozialprodukt und zu dem, was da erarbeitet wird. Dass es dann auch zum Beispiel, also Schweiz, Frankreich wird nicht ein Problem sein, aber Deutschland, Polen bei den Verträgen, bei den Löhnen natürlich jetzt noch Unterschiede gibt und die ganze Entsenderichtlinie-Debatte ist dafür. Also das heißt Konvergenz schaffen, ständig Konvergenz schaffen, damit man diese Probleme auf die Dauer überwindet.
Vielen Dank und wir geben ab an das nächste Panel.
Ich habe noch eine Verpflichtung zu erfüllen. Da müssen wir noch mal
It was good. Hello?
Okay, good.
It was great to listen to Gesine. It was...
Dankeschön. Danke.
Tschüss, Herr Merz. Auf Wiedersehen, Herr Gerke.
Hello, everybody. I was saying it was great to listen to Gesine speaking in German with Beethoven behind. It was a great moment. Thank you very much for joining. Hello, Marike. Hello, Gesine. Hello, Kishver. I would like first to start this discussion by thanking Pervenche for delivering the keynote speech on this session. She started with a very interesting history thing, and it's going to be important to understand each other now to have this in mind. And then she finished with the ESA review, and that was one of the main topic of our French discussion here. The subject is extremely large, actually, so you can deal with it from a very technical and financial perspective, or you can deal with it with more political questions. So as I said, here in Paris, we stayed in our comfort zone. I must confess that with you, dear panelists, I'm going to have to step aside because some of the issues you are specialists of are not necessarily familiar for me. Let me introduce in London Lady Faulkner. Kishver is a member of the House of Lords, chairman of the EU Subcommittee on Financial Affairs. She was born in Pakistan, but she has plenty of links in Europe. She lives in London. She has plenty of links in Europe, in Germany, in Italy, in France. In Germany, more personal links. And I would like to, I mentioned it for my French colleagues this morning. That's very nice to have London in these discussions. First, because you are still in the EU, so that's the good news. And second, as I was saying to my French colleagues this morning, to speak of finance and economy in Europe without London would be like doing a Champions League without a London club, or a European League without a London club, and that would be a pity. In Frankfurt, Dr. Gesine Schwan, and you are, Doctor, the person who will be the most difficult for me, because you are going to speak of your projects at your NGO, a project which concerns refugees, so it's not necessarily a topic we are familiar with. Gesine, you accepted to speak in English, despite you perfectly speak French. And in Amsterdam, Marike, with the chief economist of ING, and I hope, Marike, you will forgive my reference to Champions League at the beginning of this discussion. Marike will bring us her Dutch realistic vision on what should be the priorities of Europe and keeping in mind this question of subsidiarity versus more integration.
I will try, Laurent.
If you agree, before talking with Gesine, we will have to leave us during the discussion. Before talking with Gesine, I would have a preliminary question to Kishva, which I think could be a good introduction to our discussion. Before the referendum, as you all remember, David Cameron obtained the removal for the UK of our 60-year-old agenda of ever closer union. Could you help us, Kishva, to understand why this question was so sensitive in your country and the link you make between this question, this issue, and our discussion of today?
Thank you very much, Laurent. Yes, it's a esoteric issue, this one, about ever closer union, but it overshadows, I think, a lot of the discussion of where power lies across EU countries, actually. And you've mentioned my various other EU connections, Italy, Germany. I see the same discussion, not framed the same way, but the same discussion taking place. Where power lies. When the treaties started with the desire to have ever closer union of the peoples of Europe, in the context of the aftermath of the war, that seemed entirely, yes, a little idealistic, but entirely an objective that we had to move towards. But I don't think the wording of that question, it wasn't calling for fraternal sentiments. You're French, you will know what I mean about fraternité, égalité, and so on. It wasn't calling for fraternal sentiments. The end result of calling for an ever closer union is a union, a country, a super union perhaps, but a country. And I think here profoundly the United Kingdom, which had been a union, a very close union of its 4 countries till 25 years ago, was moving in the other direction in more recent times. So we realized that in order to preserve our union, we had to give away power to Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And while we did that, it's the 20th anniversary this year of doing that, while we did that, the treaties, the Constitutional Convention and then eventually Lisbon, were moving towards the unification, the unity of Europe in a rule-making legislative framework. So this wasn't fraternal links between people, it was cast in iron, law-making, court of justice, moving towards a framework. And there were some profound questions post-Lisbon, or leading up to Lisbon, about democratic accountability. Now, where that links into what you're talking about today, integration versus subsidiarity, if you're wanting subsidiarity, then the concept of subsidiarity is that each act should be done at the appropriate level. That I remember many years ago when the discussion first started in the late 90s, that each act should be done as close to the local level of accountability as possible. But the profound question is, which was never answered when the concept was first enunciated in the treaties, of who makes the decision about the appropriate level. And if it's a technocratic decision taken in a remote place, when you have within the national member states politicians standing up year after year and saying, that happened or that happened, I can't do anything about it because it comes from the EU, and 55% of our laws come from the EU, then subsidiarity seems extremely thin as a concept. People don't feel it. People don't see. Subsidiarity has to employ an element of power and accountability, and that doesn't seem to exist. So it seemed to me that David Cameron's negotiation, the 4 points that he achieved, this was actually quite profound. It wasn't really commented upon at the time, but what it was a marker to say we had gone this far in terms of integration and we would go no further. I should also remind your audience of something they may not know, but prior to that negotiation, the United Kingdom Parliament had passed an act of Parliament to say that the next time there was going to be treaty change in the EU that involved any change in the powers between the member states and the EU, that there would have to be a referendum. This was the European Union Referendum Act of 2011. So the mood in the UK, in all political parties, that was passed in the House of Commons during the coalition government, the mood in all political parties was an acceptance that we had gone as far as we could to integrate, that we had reached the limit of integration. And hence, Cameron came away claiming this had been a success, that we wouldn't be bound by future integration. And that was the significance of that particular negotiation.
Thank you. We will come back maybe to this point later on. I would like to switch to Gesine because she will have to leave earlier to take a flight, I guess. Gesine, when we talk together, so you chair an NGO which makes very different things from what I understood. One of them being to work on a project for integration of refugees in Germany. And so, as I said in my introduction, I must confess it's not a subject we are necessarily familiar with. But when we talk together, you were saying that for you, it was European Union which was at stake on this issue of refugees, and that you consider that if we were unable to solve this question, which is more sensitive in Germany probably than in France, that if we are unable to solve this issue, we would not go further in European integration. Could you explain us that, and then to elaborate a little bit on what you do with your NGO and this project?
Very much so. Thank you very much. And I would like very tightly to connect to what Mrs. Baroness Faulkner has just said, because as I got her, she saw a clear tension between European integration and power of people and democracy. This is a main problem, and I think this is not only true for Great Britain. This is also true for other countries. It is not true that subsidiarity, which is only understood on the level of national states, really brings power or control back to people. And therefore, because we have the same tension also within national democracies, that people have the impression that they don't have any more sufficient influence on their daily life, on their environment, etc. And therefore, I think that generally, in order to strengthen as well our national democracies as European democracies, and by that also strengthen integration in the sense of identification, either with the country or with the European Union, one should give much more co-participation or participation power on the level of the municipalities. I have heard from a colleague from the British Parliament that concerning refugees, one member of the Labour Party tried out to influence the municipality, I don't remember the name, in Yorkshire, which is a complicated region in English, as far as I see, for social and labour reasons. They wanted to introduce about 300 refugees to this small town of about 20,000 inhabitants. They didn't want, the people didn't want them. And then they went and talked to them and asked them, listen, we want to give you the reasons why that could also be in your interest and why that could be a good contribution to the general question of migration and refugees in our times. But we promise that you will be deciding at the end of our discussion if you want them or not. This was it was not just to explain them or to take them with them, but just to leave them the decision about that. And at the end of the day, they decided for taking the refugees. And for me, this is important. A main problem and challenge in our countries is that citizens don't feel sufficiently ask for co-determination, for participation. And if we can manage to strengthen participation on the level of municipalities in general, we can also strengthen satisfaction with democracy. And I mean by that not to replace decision-making of elected institutions, as the mayor or whatsoever of municipalities, but it is an advisory thing, a development advisory board. And what I am advising, and we have just come back from a conference of Riga, of Scandinavia, where we have everywhere the same problem. Municipalities and towns could much better integrate in a larger sense their population. And it's not only refugees, it's also poorer people, it's people with disabled people. We have a large scale of integration necessity. We can do that if we do it with an advisory multi-stakeholder board. This is a typical development constellation in development policy, which we consider always with Africa, etc. But we have also to develop in Europe. It's not just Africa or other countries. And if we install on the level of municipalities, by the invitation of the mayors, people from business, from organized civil society, and of course also municipality administration and mayors, and ask, listen, where do you want to be in 10 years? What are our interests? What are our opportunities? What are our possibilities concerning labor market, etc.? And what are also our needs concerning the labor market? Then I think we could come to a much more equilibrated, fruitful result concerning integration on the social and on the political sense within the country and also with the European Union. This is what I'm pleading for.
Kishver, you seem to have some reactions on that?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I didn't know you were speaking to me. Yes, I mean, I quite agree with Dr. Schwan on almost everything that she said, and that's absolutely vital. The question of immigration, though, there is one other issue. And I think that one of the challenges you have with immigration in countries which have non-contributory access to benefits is that, as we have in the UK, and it's a particular problem here, but our health service, our many of the an element of housing benefits and so on, many of the things which people use when they arrive, which newcomers use when they arrive. And I should say, by the way, I'm an immigrant to the United Kingdom, so I know a little bit about this. I came here some years ago with 2 suitcases, not one, but still as a migrant. That what happens in a non-contributory system is that when you get pressure of an enlarging population, as we've had in the last 20 years here in the UK, that when you get those pressures of an enlarging population and there isn't a clear link between who is paying for what, then mythologies can fly. Mythologies like, they're taking all our houses away. The reason my daughter can't get a house is because they're taking the houses. The reason my kid is in an over-large classroom is because their kids, it's full of foreign kids now. You know, that kind of thing. And I think that's where governments need to, I think the United Kingdom government made 2 profound mistakes. One was not to have the break, to use the 7-year break when the Eastern European countries opened up, the A7 came in 2004. We had the opportunity of having a 7-year break and taking them in after that gradually. We didn't do that. We opened our doors instantly, and there were very profound consequences because Tony Blair's government expected, I remember very clearly asking questions about this, 50,000 per year. We ended up by having 150,000 and currently well over 200,000 a year. So we couldn't prepare for it. And I think the other mistake we made is that we in the UK, where everyone has access to everything based simply on universality, for example, child benefit, there's been the story about workers who come and work here, yet their children back in their countries have access to child benefit. Those things should have been based on a stricter contributory system. But we weren't allowed to do that, coming back to subsidiarity, because that was seen as discrimination. In the EU context, if we had treated, that means we would have had to do it for the whole population. To be fair to Blair, the Labour government did try to do that by having ID cards, which at least would have allowed people to prove that they were entitled to or not entitled to certain things. So the mythology could have been addressed by ID cards, not the problem itself, but the mythology at least could have been addressed by that. And Parliament failed to do that. So I think, while I completely agree with Dr. Schwan that integration has to happen from the grassroots up and has to start from local level and go up, but the state and the EU also have to understand the factors that are holding it back.
May I just give a short answer, because I totally agree with you. There are two more elements which have to be added. First of all, without justice for those who come, but for those who are already there, that won't work. And for that, I'm very much pleading for an incentive system that, first of all, it should be voluntary. Second, that the costs for integration should be replaced by the European Union, and that the municipality should get the same amount of money which the integration would cost for their own development, so that you would not have just an advantage for those who arrive, but also an advantage for those who are there. That because this is why I'm also searching for a broader term of integration. We have in Germany, and supposedly you have the same thing. We have in Germany the problem that housing, for instance, is a very, very grand problem. And if people in a municipality learn that for the refugees you will build houses, and they have waited for a low rent apartment for 5 years, this is of course a reason for resentment, and you have to avoid that. So I mean, how you technically then spell out all that is another question. But I think the EU should be the source to a large amount for investment also on the municipality level, at the participation on where the investment goes, and where it should help should be on the municipality level, but also, of course, integration in the larger sense of the word.
Could I come back just briefly on just a final thought on that? All of those things are absolutely right. You've discussed economics and you've discussed the legal frameworks. The elephant in the room is race, colour, religion, culture. That's essentially what makes integration a hurdle. That's what makes local communities resistance. Dr. Schwan, you will know that. You will know from what happened on New Year's Eve in, I think it was Cologne, 2 years ago, and the public reaction to that. You've seen the rise of the AfD in Germany. Ultimately, while everything else may be perfectly in place, but you cannot make people's values cohere and become a uniform set of values overnight. That's a process that I really know it from having lived here, takes a period of time.
Marika, before we switch to economic matters, you wanted to react?
Well, what I hear here, the examples of people, either refugees or immigrants coming to either Germany or to the UK, there's a lot of room for local politicians to actually support the local communities in receiving all those people coming in. So, for example, in the UK, if I understand it correctly, there were limited investments, for example, in the health services or in education, and that was as a consequence of this. Local people were actually suffering because of all the people coming in. If I look at Germany, of course there are local possibilities for helping refugees get a job, but not only them, but also local people via education, for example. So I believe that what we see here, the risk is that we leave local politicians too much room to say to people, we can't help this, it's a European problem, whereas in reality there are local options to solve this and to make both the incoming people as well as the local people feel much better about this. So the risk here is that we see Europe as a scapegoat. And this has happened way too much in the last decades. And as a consequence, of course, people are very negative about Europe. But that's just a political response to things happening where politicians find it very comfortable to say, well, this was not our mistake. It's a European issue. And this was not always rightfully so. They were just blaming someone where they had the room to actually make a change themselves.
This sounds familiar in France because we had this problem during a long time. Marieke, if we switch to economic matters, because you are first an economist, Europe is not too badly positioned in terms of growth, but people have the feeling it's mainly used to deleverage and that they never see any progress in their day-to-day life. Is it the case in Netherlands first, and is it your thinking about Europe in general?
Well, what we see in the Netherlands is that we have seen nice economic growth over the last couple of years. So we've seen nice GDP numbers being presented to us. And many people are saying, well, we don't really experience this in our daily life. And we did some research here, we went into the statistics, and we actually noticed that this is not just a feeling. People really haven't experienced a lot of economic growth in the last couple of years. If we look at Dutch households, the average household is still consuming less than it was pre-crisis. And of course, this means something for people. It has an effect on their daily life. They basically really still have difficulty making ends meet. And the reason that they have this is, first of all, that we had a very heavy crisis, of course. And then secondly, we were basically both fixing the institutions. So all sorts of new regulations were being developed. In the Netherlands, we also tried to tackle the aging problem at the same time. So pension reforms were installed, healthcare reforms were started. And at the same time, we also tried to deleverage. So both households for mortgage debt, but also the government has been trying to deleverage. What this means is that we've not seen a lot of economic progress, but the progress that we've seen hasn't really ended up in basically the households. So what I believe we see currently is people say, okay, I'm part of Europe, I'm part of this capitalist system which needed fixing, which was about there was something wrong with the banks, we don't exactly understand what's going on, but it wasn't really for us, because look at what is happening to our daily financial situation. It's not improved. And of course, this makes it very difficult to make people enthusiastic about the economic benefits of Europe. And I believe this is not only the case for the Netherlands, this is also the case for many European regions, where we see that there's relatively little growth over the last couple of years, because basically the story is that we've been trying to fix institutions and we've been trying to make sure that our governments were deleveraging, which is all very wise from a long-term perspective, but very painful on the short run. And I believe this is actually not really, I mean, from an economic sense, I will say that in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, we will be happy that we did it. But on the short run perspective, we must acknowledge the fact that people have really become very angry with what the European project has meant to them in an economic sense.
Isn't it also because the financial risk management and the consequences of the financial crisis had to be dealt with also, no?
Of course, I mean, of course, this was a necessity. Yeah? So in many ways, definitely the rebuilding or the improvement of institutions was necessary, and it had to be done. And I personally believe that a lot of we were much too prone to a crisis, and there were many mechanisms which basically worsened the crisis just because the monetary union was far from complete. And it's improved, and that's very relevant for the future, because the chances of a crisis again being happening of the same magnitude as what we've seen over the last couple of years, those have been diminished very strongly. But by also deleveraging so strongly and putting so much focus on that with the whole Stability and Growth Pact, which meant very little room for fiscal policy. And of course, here in the Netherlands, we're very keen to avoid any room for fiscal policy because we really want to make sure we're a Calvinist country, so we do that at home, and we want other countries to behave the same. So the long-term effects, I believe, will be beneficial, but the short-run effects were very, very painful.
Gesine, before you leave, I don't know exactly at which time you must leave. Do you have the feeling that we share common priorities in general? That's a question I intended to raise to Marieke, but I could raise it to you as well. Do you have the feeling that European people at the time of these elections shares common priorities in terms of European integration?
At least I have the impression that the three women share common ideas and common understanding much more easy way than others maybe. Maybe this is my very short feminist contribution. But
I'm sorry to be the only man in the discussion.
No, we have also minority protection. This is also a women's endeavor. No, but the other point is, I think the experience is, as soon as you come closer to the problems and more precise, and you do not just stay on a superficial level where you throw to each other ideological terms, then you come to common values and to common understanding. I'm not so sure, I'm not an economist, but I'm not so sure if it is only the short-term consequence of the pursued economic policies which are not so good, but I do even think that the long-term consequences of that policy is not so good. The whole term of reforms has to be spelled out very clearly, because you have behind that a certain theory of the priority and kind of absolute priority of a balanced budget, and the whole question if a state and a state budget should kind of balance more in a more differentiated way what will be investments, what will be debts, etc., and credits. This is, I think, the absolute priority which especially the German government and our finance minister Schäuble has put on this idea of having a budget which is totally in balance has not been good for a number of economies. This is a kind of leveling of the very different economic situations of different countries in Europe, which hasn't been okay. But I would wish, and this is again, and I'm finishing with this kind of feminist touch, I think if we could come really closer together and really understanding what we want each other, and of course to see that if we want to go on with Europe, we cannot only keep to the national point of view, although the power source of all these governments is of course national elections. But I do even think that within the national societies there is more understanding if we argue precisely than we feel it now. So I'm pleading very much for understanding that Europe is absolutely necessary for everybody, has an advantage, but the advantages are very, very differently spread within the societies. We have to be much more just within the societies. We have to be much more balanced, and then we can also go on with European integration. And disintegrated national societies won't work to integrate Europe. That will never work. Policies can only be integrated if they work with integrated societies. This goes together very closely.
Thank you. If we come back to economy, Marieke, is it the time for more government spending in Europe and in northern countries in particular?
Well, of course, I mean, the European Commission has been saying for a number of years to countries such as my country and to Germany that there's room for additional government spending. Now, I mean, it sounds kind of odd to do that in economies which already have very high employment. So basically the defense from the Netherlands has always been, we don't really need it, our economy is doing fine and we don't want to risk overheating it. But you may well say that there are reasons for investing locally also. One reason could be to make the energy transition a bit smoother, for example. And there's a lot of resistance in the Netherlands to the energy transition, not so much to the fact that it's taking place, but the fact that people fear that they will have to pay for it themselves and they can't afford it. Those households which have been suffering economically are now very reluctant to see this happen because they fear that they will really not be able to pay their energy bills. Now, the government may use the room which it has currently to spend something on that, and that for future generations it will pay off. So you don't necessarily have to spend just for the sake of spending. You may well think about, okay, so exactly what does Dutch society need currently? What are the fears of people? So, for example, the energy transition, but also we see here in the Netherlands, we were just talking about opportunities for people. We see in our educational system that equal opportunities are becoming more and more of a problem. So we have a whole lot of statistics which show that in the Netherlands, young people who are going to schools really are beginning to diverge in the sense that lower and middle educated people have children which have less opportunities than the children of higher educated people. So by investing in education, for example, you also invest in the future growth potential of your country. So I believe the Netherlands has a lot of room to, within the European framework, both make a gesture towards the European Commission and also do something which would be very helpful on a shorter and a longer run for Dutch people. So I would really welcome this way of thinking because I believe it's not only it's not just about growing GDP, it's about growing a GDP which helps people to enjoy life and be more optimistic about the future, because that's really what we lack currently. The current status of Europe is the status of a continent which is growing, but it's only growing very slowly and people don't experience progress. And if Europe is not delivering on that economic promise, it loses a bit of its credibility, I believe, and that's a shame.
Kishver, seen from London, all these debates are still in the discussions, or are you so much concerned by Brexit that you only speak of Brexit? I mean, all these questions of we are talking about in continental Europe. Do you have the same issues? How is it handled in terms of public debate? Thank you, Gesine. Bye bye. No, it was scheduled. Huh?
It sounds like a contradiction in terms, but some parts of the United Kingdom are consumed by Brexit. I would say that's our civil service and parts of our government. And other parts have nothing to do. If you read the newspapers this morning in the United Kingdom, you would realize that we're having another holiday in Parliament, another 11 days off. Last month we had 2 weeks off. So we go home very early. We don't work that hard because there's nothing to do. So we're extremely interested in what's happening across the water, across the English Channel. Yes, I mean, my committee is as I said, economic and financial affairs, so it has oversight of the EU budget, and of course we see very closely what's happening in the Eurozone, because whether we're in the Eurozone or not, it impacts us. So if I could pick up 1 or 2 points that Marieke Bloem made. You advocated, Ms. Bloem, very strongly that politicians should be spending more on things to do with to improve inequality and to improve social mobility. I completely agree with you. But if you're a Eurozone country, then you don't have the levers to do that, because, as you yourself acknowledged, that the fiscal tools were lost in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And if you're an Italian now, trying to cope with the pressures of just endless migration, extremely poor infrastructure, historic lack of investment and historic political instability. But if you're an Italian now and you want to spend money on, not least on having garbage collected in Rome, never mind anything else, you can't do that. You can't do that because you're breaching the budget rules of the Eurozone. So that, it is, although we're not in the Eurozone, we see very clearly the arguments going on in the Eurozone. And very interestingly, our main opposition party sees the EU as a neoliberal project. A neoliberal project because the straitjacket, the rules are so tight that it doesn't allow for, I think you described this as local decision-making. I don't call it local, I call it member states. It's not local. Local implies very small. Member states are still the controllers of what happens in the EU. Maybe not for long, but they still are. But it doesn't allow member states the leverage that they need to do the things that they need. To stabilize the Eurozone, you need a deposit guarantee scheme. Well, we know how Mr. Schäuble felt about that in Germany not so long ago. And I don't see Mr. Scholz running to do it either. So I think the profound and fundamental problem is that outright monetary transactions have reduced the ability of savers to get any return on their capital. The rules on TLAC and MREL have made it pretty difficult for institutions like banks to make any money. Perhaps our chairman would have some sympathy with that. You have non-performing loans across many countries. You see the big investment firms in the EU under quite a lot of pressure and stress. And then we have so that you have all of these problems that are inherent in the Eurozone. And then you have Mr. Trump and Mr. Xi Jinping and the rise of protectionism. If you look at global trade figures of the last 3 or 4 years, global trade is actually declining. It's not increasing on the trajectory it should have. If you see the biggest IPOs, they're happening in East Asia. They're not happening in Europe. Europe is actually in a very weak place globally in terms of its preparedness for the future of work, the future of technology, and it's in a very poor place in its preparedness for what happens if there is another crash, which I'm quite worried about.
Well, if I would say that the current concern, of course, but we can never be entirely sure that if a crisis would hit, we wouldn't suffer from it. But I would say that the crisis response mechanisms have really improved a lot over the last couple of years. What I agree with is the fact that many of our services markets, be it energy, telecommunications, digital services, or banking, are still very fragmented. And this makes it very difficult for companies to actually benefit from the enormous scale that the European market in theory has to offer to them. So one of the things that was a recurring theme here this morning in the Netherlands is that we would actually say that, you were saying that integration has gone too far from a UK perspective, but we would say that in many respects the European integration has not gone far enough for companies to actually be able to benefit from that European market. And we don't necessarily want companies to benefit from that European market. The reason why we want that is because we all here in the room believe that if we have a European banking market, if we have a European telecoms market, if we have a European digital market, then in the end, we as consumers can all benefit from that very strongly. So if you are looking at what the European Union needs to work with in the next decade or so, we would say here in the Netherlands, please open up these markets. Please make sure that regulation in the various markets is similar so that companies can actually compete and in that way offer better services to consumers at a lower price. This is possible for Europe, but the whole problem is that it also means that local politicians have to make compromises. And one of the things I must admit as being a Dutch person is that we see that our own politicians, when they go into Europe, they actually are very, very reluctant to make any compromises. And what they seem to be telling in that political debate is that they can't really sell any of these compromises back at home. So be it about the Stability and Growth Pact, about the fiscal discipline, but also about any other measure. Our politicians go into Europe explaining to Europe that the whole of Europe has to become as the Netherlands is. And the interesting thing is that if you look at basically polls where people are being asked how they feel about Europe, I don't believe that the Dutch people are as Euro-critical as our Dutch politicians are. So one of the things we were saying here this morning is that it seems to be that our Dutch politicians seem to be less eager about Europe than Dutch voters are. And maybe 2 years ago, Dutch voters weren't so optimistic about Europe, but this has really changed with the changing environment, with the position of the US, with China, also with the dealing with Brexit. People have become much more pro-European here in the Netherlands, and I believe, therefore, our Dutch politicians at least should take the room to begin with opening up these markets, but also laying the foundation for future growth, because I believe that Dutch people at least are ready to begin compromising.
The problem, Marike, is also a question of horizon, which is that the points you mentioned in terms of better integration of financial markets or whatever, or banking markets, would have positive effects for citizens, but in a long term or in a mid-term perspective.
That's true. That's also one of the things we were saying. I mean, as an economist, of course, I love the whole idea of creative destruction. So what I want to happen is companies compete with each other, some win, some lose, and in the end, as a consumer, I benefit, and that means that also as a worker, I benefit, because I will be more productive and I will earn a higher wage and I will be able to afford more. However, this simple story, which I as an economist can tell, on the short run, it also means that there will be people losing. And one of the things that my profession in the past has not really acknowledged is that maybe on average people gain, but there are losers of this whole system of economic progress. And we know from psychology that people who are losing actually experience that loss much more emotionally than people will be experiencing what they gain. So there are all sorts of experiments where basically if you have one person winning €1 and one person losing €1, then overall they will be less happy than they were before, because that one person who's lost €1 is much more unhappy than that one person who won €1. And this is one of the fundamental issues, I believe, in progress, which also on the short run means losers, as you were saying, for politicians to explain that to people, that in the longer run this will pay off, that will be very difficult. One thing about that, though, Europeans tend to speak about this in very, very technical, formal language. So one of the things I would really, really be happy to see is if people would not be so much speaking about something like banking union or capital markets union. It's very difficult for people to understand that. What we want to happen is that the best companies can get the best access to finance, and then they can produce the best things for us. And this all, it's very basic, but it needs to be explained a lot better, that we're not doing banking union because banks are benefiting from it, or capital markets union because companies are benefiting from it, but we're doing it because that's what we believe will be best for people.
I knew that it would be a very open debate. I didn't think we would finish with psychology or things like that, but that's not surprising. Kishore, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I wanted to add many, many things, which is, I'm afraid,
you have
as
10
the only
minutes
politician
left
in the room, from what I can tell. I'm not a local politician. I'm a national politician. So just let me make that point. Coming to competition, Capital Markets Union, the biggest capital market is in the US. In the world. The biggest global capital market is the US. Second biggest capital market is the United Kingdom. So, you know, it's very well to want certain things to happen in Europe, quite necessarily, and I agree completely with Marike Bloom here, that Eurozone, an optimal currency areas integration is not yet in place. And you're not going to get the benefits of an optimal currency union until all of the architecture is in place. So it's easy to blame politicians and to say they can't explain to people that the longer term will benefit them. The democratic cycle in most of these countries that we're talking about in the EU is between 4 and 5 years. You get your exams at the end of either 4 or 5 years, you pass or you fail. It is very hard to say to your examiner, the public, give me another 15 years and I'll fix it for you. You know, people aren't there. One of the issues with democratic accountability that I was referring to earlier, and the rule of technocrats, is that if a politician signs up to a treaty change, let's take Lisbon as an example, he's gone 1 year later. He's not there to offer an explanation of why he did that. He might have promised a referendum or not. It's the next lot who have to explain what happened and why power has gone away from them and gone somewhere else, and why they have to stand up when stuff happens that people in their country don't like. They have to say, it wasn't me, Gov, it was somebody else. I know that the ideal of European integration is ruled by technocrats. That is the ideal. If you can get your populations to sign up to that, bravo to you. I know that we can't here in the UK, and nor in half a dozen other European countries that I know well. But let me say to you about the Netherlands, and let me defend your government a little bit. You only need to look as far back as the Ukraine referendum you had. The referendum was about something very particular to do with assistance for Ukraine. It got hijacked by anti-EU people. So Mr. Rutte, poor Mr. Rutte, maybe not poor, very nice Mr. Rutte, but Mr. Rutte has to look over his shoulder because you had Geert Wilders. You have had a rise of anti-EU parties in the Netherlands, just like everywhere else in Europe. Actually, I find it one of the unique things about the United Kingdom is that we don't get the Front National, we don't get the AfD. We don't get those kind of parties here, touch wood, as yet. But we will do that if the politicians do what you're encouraging us to do, which is ignore the will of the people and ignore democratic accountability.
Yeah. I don't know whether it's a conclusion. Marike, I let you answer.
Well, one of the interesting things, I actually went to visit the UK 2 years ago because people were beginning to think that Nexit would be the next thing after Brexit in the 2017 elections, where the Freedom Party was expected to win. And then one of the interesting things I experienced there is that, of course, the UK perspective on Europe is so entirely different. So I understand what you're saying about taking voters with you and making sure that this is not just a technocratic story. But it's also good to realize that the Netherlands is, in essence, a very European country. And people in the Netherlands are very aware of the fact that we really, really benefit a lot from European Union. We're very small, we're a traders nation, we're a transport nation, we're a hub to Europe, and everyone here is basically raised to be aware of the fact that we benefit so much from European Union. So one of the things I'm referring to is there have been a lot of polls in the Netherlands over the last couple of weeks, of course, with the European elections coming up. And they actually turned out to be quite pro-European. So if you ask people, for example, would they consider a Nexit a positive thing, depending on which poll you pick, it's either 8 or 12% of the people, Dutch people, who would support that. So what I'm seeing is that, yes, about 2 years ago, people were more critical of the European Union and of the Eurozone, but that's really changed over the last couple of years. And what's interesting is that it seems that our politicians are currently really in a different position from where the people are. So it's as if they are still doing the elections of 2 years ago in the way they are approaching any European subject, rather than looking at what people experience currently. And basically the last couple of years for many Dutch people, I believe, have really been kind of a new way of looking at Europe and a much more positive way than what used to be the case about 2 years ago. That basically having common enemies has really made a difference here. So I understand where you are coming from, and I agree that we don't see this happening in the UK, but we've really seen a change here in the Netherlands. But politicians seem to be reluctant or maybe not aware of what's going on here.
Every time we talk together on these issues, we understand why we had the Brexit. Thank you very much for this open discussion. I hope it answered your what you were waiting for in the subject, and I wish you a good rest of the day. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you, Laurent.
Thank you.